Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. You know, for 25 years or so, stuff was going up in price faster than you could borrow money. Now we're in a period where stuff is going down in price faster than governments can get rid of all that debt. It's called deflation, and the governments are saying, you know what? We need to impose more austerity. Austerity and more austerity. Let's bring in Stacy Herbert.
Max, speaking of austerity, cost of royal family drops 7p per person. Yes, the Queen and the royal family in Great Britain cost the taxpayer 62p per person last year, a drop of 7p, according to Buckingham Palace, which has released their accounts. The total cost of keeping the monarchy has decreased by £3.3 million to only £38.2 million per year.
What can we extrapolate from this? Where are we going with this information? Please tell us more.
You could extrapolate from this that there's deflation, but something else it inspired me to think about is that £38 million a year for this royal family seems like a better deal than the £1 trillion government in Parliament. You know, we just celebrated 4th of July in America, and there's 14th of July coming up in France when they overthrew monarchies. Maybe it's a time to redo it, like overthrow the governments and replace it with these monarchies who are groveling. You know, the Queen is there groveling to the people saying, I only cost you 62p per year. Please accept this. We want a government like that.
Yeah.
That will grovel at our feet.
So the cost of the monarchy is now cheaper. So after 200 years, they've been kind of weaned off of their huge empire-like tentacles and their overhead. And now they're the most cost-efficient form of government out there, especially in the UK.
Well, you look at that, okay, so you see the Queen groveling. Now, look at this in the U.S. where you have a democracy. 2 headlines. Dean Heller, is the government creating hobos with benefit extensions? Dean Heller is a Republican congressman from Nevada. Mm-hmm. Here's South Carolina Lieutenant Governor Andre Bauer compares helping poor to feeding stray animals.
Right, so you've got people in government now who are acting like the old monarchs and treating the people like peasants.
Exactly.
They're saying,
how is that let them eat cake?
Right. They're demeaning to the people, and they're condescending to the people in the American government and elsewhere. And meanwhile, as you say, the Queen herself is groveling for a few p every year to keep Buckhouse afloat.
Because they are the hobos. The people who we finance with our taxes are the hobos. We're not the hobos.
Right. That's right. That's important to consider. This is welfare for, essentially, the ruling class that have abdicated their real any kind of self-worth in terms of working for a living, and they've gotten entirely in the business of basically taxing and warmongering. That seems to be the only real business left for these powerful sorts.
That's, of course, why the monarchies of old had their heads cut off, because they had many wars and kept on taxing the people.
So you're saying history has come full circle, in other words.
History has come full circle.
So the people who rebelled against the monarchs have become themselves petty monarchs, and the monarchs are groveling for handouts.
That's correct. So this takes me to the present democratically elected government in the UK. Cameron orders ministers to draw up 40% spending cuts, the biggest in history. So these are the austerity measures. And recall that last week he was saying, oh, it's going to be 20% cuts. Now he says 40% cuts. These are the biggest in modern history. But I say, let's call for 100% cuts.
Yeah, exactly. Get rid of all of the government. Get rid of Cameron and his entire cabinet and just flip it back to the Queen. Right? Because she's more efficient. She's more cost efficient in ruling that country.
Exactly. Well, it sounds like he might be in competition for that, because he's saying, I'm going to cut government spending by 40%, but it's still...
Cut it by 100%.
Hundreds of billions.
Right. Fire yourself. Do your country a favor and fire yourself, David Cameron. George Osborne, fire yourself. Do your country a favor. You've already got a queen there. You've already got the whole infrastructure to have a ruling elite. And it's cheaper.
So... this takes me on to the other bastion of democracy, Clinton warns activists being crushed by steel vice around the world. Now, I saw this headline, and I thought, oh my God, Hillary Clinton is standing up for all those activists at the G20 who were there to protest these unelected monarchs of our new system who are dispensing stimulus programs to the bankers and bailouts. And apparently there was very harsh treatment of these activists, and I thought she was standing up for them. No.
You would be wrong.
She was naming the countries of Zimbabwe, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Cuba, Egypt, Iran, Venezuela, China, and Russia. She says, quote, some of the countries engaging in these behaviors still claim to be democracies. Democracies don't fear their own people. They recognize that citizens must be free to come together, to advocate and agitate. Well, we're agitating. We're asking for 100% austerity measures. Get out of there.
Yeah, I mean, Hillary Clinton, remember the RNC, Republican National Convention, and the Democratic National Convention, when the police in America could buy insurance against breaking the law? And then they went into these conventions, broke heads, caused all kinds of mayhem, and were acting as tyrannical force of the ruling elite. And, of course, their insurance kicked in, and they made money on their tyranny. I mean, that's what Hillary Clinton should be focused on. Look in the mirror, Hillary Clinton, although that might be kind of scary in her case.
Well, here's a headline from America. Photographer detained for taking pics of BP refinery as up to 100% of Pensacola area reservations canceled. So in the Gulf region, journalists, including CNN, are now being told stay 60 feet away from any of the oil spill disaster, and if you don't listen to us, you will be fined by $40,000 and face Class D felony charges. Here's Anderson Cooper of CNN.
A new rule announced today backed by the force of law and the threat of fines and felony charges. A rule that will prevent reporters and photographers and anyone else from getting anywhere close to booms and oil-soaked wildlife and just about any place we need to be. We're not the enemy here. Those of us down here trying to accurately show what is happening, we are not the enemy.
You are the enemy, Anderson Cooper. I mean, this is shocking. And where's Hillary Clinton on this case? Here you have a total violation of First Amendment right there in the United States, down there in the Gulf of Mexico, and you've got BP, British imperial power, telling Americans that they can't get within 60 feet with their cameras and their observation because they know what they're doing is committing an ecological holocaust. And just like a holocaust of the past, they try to keep that as quiet as possible.
Well, that brings me to the next headline, Max. BP criminal case and oil spill may be inevitable, analysts say. Well, apparently the Obama administration so far is on the fence about charging BP with any sort of criminal negligence due to the fact that they kind of believe they're too big to fail. They don't want the company to fail. But a private civil racketeering lawsuits have now been brought on behalf of property and business owners in Alabama, Louisiana, and Florida. So they're charging them with RICO, Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act.
Yeah, that's right, RICO. That's the thing you got to do because they commit a lot of individual crimes and they say technically we're innocent. That's why you got to put them all together, understand it's a corrupt enterprise and it's a racket. And you got to go after them using RICO, baby. This is what Rudy Giuliani did, of course, when he went after Mike Milken and Drexel back in the 80s. And this also brings up another interesting point. I don't know if you want to get into this or not, but it's also between states versus the federal government because these states want to go after this company because, since the federal government has abdicated its role of defending the people. And we saw this in the tobacco litigation. The states ultimately prevailed, and they're going to use that lesson to go after the eco-terrorist BP.
Well, actually, the tobacco legislation is brought up in the final headline. Texas AG candidate sues Goldman et al. For causing recession, unemployment, and everything else that's bad. So the Democrat candidate for Texas Attorney General Barbara Ann Rednofsky has filed a legal complaint against Goldman Sachs Group, Morgan Stanley, UBS, Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, Citigroup, Credit Agricole, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, meaning the banks, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, the rating agencies, AIG Insurance Company, and other John Doe defendants. The basis of the lawsuit apparently comes from this. Quote, the U.S. Supreme Court recognizes the state's right to sue to protect its physical and economic well-being. The doctrine permits damages from such underlying theories as common law fraud and RICO, and survived motions to dismiss in the state tobacco litigation. So there you go. It's basically RICO again, and just to remind everybody, RICO was enacted in 1970, and it allows the prosecution of people who operate or oversee an illegal enterprise even if they did not commit the main criminal acts in question. So remember, this was to basically take on the mafia, and the crime bosses themselves never got their fingers dirty. So they brought in RICO in order to be able to take on the bosses. So in this case, look, she's taking on these banks, but those guys are just, the captains in this banking crime family. How are we going to take on, Timothy Geithner, Ben Bernanke, as we revealed just in our last...
You sound upset. What do you think? I mean, you think you're going to take these guys on? They're entrenched now. It's an entrenched fascist state now. You got no leverage, baby. The only leverage you're going to have is if you take on 5 to 10 to 20 trillion in bad debts. Then you push back and fight fire with fire. But you're just a peanut.
And this woman is, as we were referring to in the beginning of the show, it's a democracy. So she is, importantly, as the article points out...
It was a democracy.
Well, as the article points out, she's a candidate. Barack Obama promised all sorts of change when he was a candidate. So as soon as these people get into office, of course, look at other attorney generals in office. Andrew Cuomo in New York, Richard Blumenthal in Connecticut.
Shill.
What have they done?
Nothing.
To take on the actual crime bosses operating in their turf?
Bring back Rudy Giuliani. There's a guy with enough vanity and ambition to actually get somewhere taking on bankers. And without getting caught like Elliot Spitzer with his pants down.
Well, these RICO lawsuits could be used theoretically. We've been covering this legal side of taking on the banks. It could theoretically be involved because while Timothy Geithner and Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan might not actually have their fingerprints on the crime, they are there, obviously.
Yeah, well, maybe if America didn't suck so bad, there might be some progress against these charlatans and kleptocrats. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All righty, now stay tuned because when we come back, we're going to talk to journalist Terry Buell about finding out exactly how deep does Tim Geithner's love go.
Every month we give you the future. We help you understand how we'll get there and what tomorrow will bring. The best in science and technology from across Russia and around the world. Join us for Technology Update on RT.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Let's go to freelance journalist in New York, Terry Buell, who is probably the single greatest influence in helping to defeat box office futures contracts as they are now outlawed as part of this new finance reform package that's gone through Congress. Terry Buell, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Hi, Max. It's great to see you.
Oh, great to see you. Now, box office futures, they were approved by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and then immediately banned by Congress.
Thank goodness.
Your thoughts?
I think it was an outrage from the beginning. I remember back in 2007 when I interviewed you about how much manipulation could occur if this ever occurred. I thank God that someone got in front of Senator Blanche Lincoln so that she could have some sense and outlaw it in the bill. And it's obviously clear the fact that Cantor just canceled their product.
Yeah, Cantor just dropped it like a hot potato, especially when reported on the blogosphere there was potentially a very clear conflict of interest with one of the principals over at Lionsgate Film, and they were the only ones who were suggesting that this thing would be good, and then it came out in the press, thanks to your work and others, that there was an override or a conflict of interest between these two. So we're going to keep watching that very, very closely. Let's move on to Bear Stearns, Terry Buell. The Financial News is only just reporting that Timothy Geithner and Ben Bernanke bought junk bonds for the taxpayer. But in the New York Post a year ago, you predicted that the Bear buyout would cost taxpayers. What did you know then that Timothy Geithner is now claiming they couldn't have known?
Max, it's really unbelievable, and I can't believe it took them this long to finally come out with this. Back in June of 2008, we'd received a report from a top hedge fund who had flat out said that there would be at least $1 billion of losses, at least. At that time, the Fed completely denied it. They told us that, well, we at least have BBB rated bonds in there, so isn't that investment grade? Except even months before, at the end of 2007, Mark Pittman at Bloomberg was writing numerous stories warning that these ratings weren't true. I think it's outrageous, and I think everyone always knew that.
Okay, so as a journalist working in the finance space, you reported, based on your sources, that the junk that was being passed to the Fed, a la Timothy Geithner, was just that, complete garbage.
First of all, I mean, we now have a news report out at The Atlantic, which I broke, that the guys inside of Bear Stearns were misleading the raters about the information before they even rated the bonds. And I simply don't see how Timothy Geithner, as the head of the New York Fed, who was monitoring Bear Stearns and J.P. Morgan, wasn't quite aware of the quality of the collateral that was going into these bonds. More importantly, I don't understand why J.P. Morgan, who's supposedly in this deal, didn't pick any of the collateral that Maiden Lane and the Fed and the Treasury that we all know, that we own now as taxpayers. I don't see how they didn't know that they were junk. They were Bear Stearns' transfer agent. They reviewed their collateral like for years ahead of time. They knew exactly what they were doing. And it's fraud on all of us. It's even more disgusting that Geithner and Bernanke, when it testified that they knew this would be investment grade, and I think at one point they tried to say that we're going to get $200 million off this investment by 2020. Well, I don't want $200 million in 10 years. We've already lost $1.3 billion on the assets in a year and a half.
Right, and the direct result of all this fraud on the part of Geithner is that the economy is collapsing and lots of people are losing their jobs, and there's talk about something on the magnitude of the Depression, possibly greater than the Depression, and it goes right back to Geithner's fraud. And on that front, let me ask you a question. Is it appropriate to go after these guys in a way that now people are talking about with British Petroleum or BP, that they look at these folks under the statute of RICO, the anti-racketeering laws? What are your thoughts? Is there talk about this in New York? Because remember, back in the 80s, you had Giuliani used RICO to go after Mike Milken and Drexel Burnham at that time. Is there going to be a RICO statute brought in to go after these guys at this time? Terry Boole, your thoughts?
Max, I think that's a great question. And I can tell you right now, I've had detailed conversations with not only traders in New York, but with other treasuries of other large municipalities, such as Orange County, California, which firmly believe that Geithner has overstepped any bounds of accountability and knowledge and colluded with the banks to get assets moved off. So I don't see how they couldn't. I mean, at least filing the financial reform bill, we have the General Office of Accountability who's going to be able to audit the Fed, audit who they loan to, why, what are the assets. The problem is we're not going to even get that until December. So why aren't we calling for more action now? We need to do something now. Okay,
so you're clearly making a case here. What you've seen on the journalistic side of things is collusion or some kind of cooperation that's going on behind the scenes with the Treasury Secretary who's working in cahoots with the private banking sector to defraud the American people. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. This is a clear case of fraud perpetrated by a government official resulting in lost jobs and unbelievable duress. So what are the mechanisms? Because if the law won't defend the people, what are the people supposed to do if they have not even the laws are going to help them? What can they do?
Max, it's going to be hard, I have to admit. Why we have Wall Street going hard and talking about in closed doors that they can't believe Timothy Geithner is still in office. There's relationships that the banks are too strong. They're going to have to speak out, and we're going to have to hope that more journalists look into this and that more journalists start writing about this problem so that we can get some accountability, so that our senators try to do something.
All right. Go over, for the folks who want to see the total spectrum of fraud here, review for us the role that the rating agencies played in this fraud.
Max, the worst thing that we've learned recently, and it's according to a documentary being made right now about Bear Stearns called The Confidence Game, is that we have people on the record finally from, let's say, Bear Stearns Mortgage Bond Packaging Group admitting that they got ratings for AAA products within 20 minutes. That's insane. How can you be able to manage and figure out if there's any quality in these collateral in 20 minutes? So besides the fact that we have the raters, right, who we know were paid for by the banks to do their job, I think there was just a complete lack of public responsibility in the product that they were offering. And I don't see how, I mean, we've got Andrew Cuomo finally trying to go after some of the raters. I mean, we're hoping now that some of the information's coming out, that people who have left Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers are going to talk. Well, we need them to talk about what happened, that we can finally get some traction.
I'm just looking at some of the testimony that came in from Warren Buffett. He said that, well, you know, they're just human beings and they make mistakes, as we all do. Do you buy that?
Absolutely not. There's no way that you make a mistake in 2006, or let's specifically say definitely in 2007, where you bypass everything from conference committees to the level of time to making sure that you've hired quality people to rate these products. They didn't do that. That is not what I've seen based on my interviews.
Right, and the mistake that they made apparently was repeated something like on 40,000 different securities were wrongly rated by these rating agencies, and as a result, this was a key component in the racket that has now brought together some of the most despicable forces in the United States finance. And of course, judging by what I've been reading that you've written, Timothy Geithner is really a key principle in all this. Is that correct?
I absolutely believe that. I just simply don't see how, as president of the New York Fed, he did not see in 2007 that there was a problem with the mortgage assets that his group was overseeing. And there's no way, if he just picked up a copy of Bloomberg, that he couldn't have seen, or even Trader Monthly. My God, Charlie Gasparino was writing about this in 2007, that there's a problem with the ratings.
Talk a little bit more about the Bear Stearns collapse and the deal, and what was J.P. Morgan's role in the deal?
Max, let's think about this. J.P. Morgan, as everyone said, probably got the deal of the century, right? In the matter of a few days, Tim Geithner's gone in and got a huge loan for them to be able to take over this bank, get all the good stuff, and give away all the bad stuff. Considering, as we've seen, Jamie Dimon's role and presidential favor with the administration, I think we have some serious questions here. And I still don't understand, actually, if we let Lehman Brothers fail, why didn't we let Bear Stearns fail?
Right, and of course, Jamie Dimon is discussed as a possible successor to Timothy Geithner. So they're just rearranging the same coterie of insiders who are in on the scam. Ultimately, the U.S. economy cannot take, there's a certain saturation point where fraud, they just can't sustain any more fraud, and we're at that point now. And you're in New York. I mean, that's the center of the financial industry in America, and some argue it's the center of the financial industry in the world to some degree. I mean, aren't people, are they up in arms of the fact that their city, their group of bankers are effectively destroying the country?
Wow, Max, those are some pretty strong statements there. I think that they're angry and frustrated that we still don't have jobs, that we have a housing problem that is going to hit hard in let's say, any of the tri-state areas. I think that we have a muni bond default problem that they're looking at. And at a hedge fund conference just 3 weeks ago, I had a top trader scare the heck out of the room that there's $1 trillion muni bond default coming, and Obama and Geithner aren't ready for it. We don't know what they're doing. We don't have enough information, and I think they're frustrated. And I think at the point is that they're sick of it.
Okay, so just to give some context there, the muni bond market, or the municipal bond market, these are the bonds that are issued by various municipalities and states around the country. It's another portion of the matrix of debt that underlies the economy as a whole. And what we've seen is during the scandal that we talked about at the beginning of this interview, all of the bad debt was shuffled off to the Federal Reserve off the bank's balance sheet. And in effect, there's also another huge tranche. You're saying another trillion in bad debt tied up in a fraudulent muni bond market that is yet to be dealt with and marked to market, which is going to precipitate probably another huge downleg in the real estate market. And I understand Fannie and Freddie Mac, who are part of this real estate nightmare, the ultimate bailout tab for just those two entities is going to be $1 trillion. Is this what you're hearing?
Absolutely. We have another crisis coming. There is no doubt about it. We are not ready. And the escalation is going to go back to the heart of Main Street and the middle class homeowner this time.
Okay, so the real whopper of the sell-off in the housing market and the market as a whole is coming in large part because the policies pursued by Geithner, Bernanke, and Obama back in the beginning of 2008 were the complete opposite of what they really should have been doing, which is to bail out the debtors, not the creditors. Your thoughts?
Absolutely, Max.
Well, that was easy. So, Terbiel, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank my guests, Stacy Herbert and Terry Buell. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.